Hi, I'm Matt Burns from the University of Missouri. And again, we're talking about systems and organizational change. And we've already talked about the need to create urgency, to identify the systems within the organization, to have a model. And we ended by talking about previously considering the people who actually implemented the change, the attitude, beliefs, and behaviors of the people actually implementing the change. So we're going to talk more about that in this video, it's all about the team and about how the team functions. And I'll freely admit right now that there's not a lot of good research out there. There is a lot of good thinking, a lot of good writing, some great books on this, but the research around it is not great. And actually some of the research that is done suggests questions some of the things we talk about. So this might be a little oversimplified, but for today's conversation and for most things in functionality, it works just fine. So I'm going to start by talking about the stages of small group development. Many of you have probably heard this or talked about it in Psych 100 or something. We're going to take a few minutes to review that. Starting with forming. When groups first form, and a team first forms, their main goal is to feel accepted by the group. Their desire for acceptance by the group. That's what the primary objective is. And they need to know that the group is safe, which means that when people first meet as a team, they want to see who they're alike and who they're not alike, who they're most different from. They look at who they fit with best to form future subgroups. And everything is simple with very little controversy. Most of the time when teams first meet, the conversation is pretty safe. It's not, we don't talk about things too serious. We don't talk about feelings. We're still trying to feel each other out to see, how strong of an opinion can I have before I create controversy. So at first, when we first meet as a team, it's all just to figure out who we are, who we fit with, and not a lot of controversy or feelings or serious conversation. Once we form the group, then the storming happens. And what I think most people don't realize is that this is a normal part of the process. Now, everyone will notice this little graphic down here. So I spent a lot of time figuring out how to do that. So storming. Storming is when the group members attempt to organize for the task. So now they're starting to get serious about things and trying to figure out what's going to happen, how they're going to do it. So they're trying to organize, which means conflict is inevitable. And the conflict will dichotomize a team. So people will align with other members who think like they do on the particular team. And we see an increased desire for structural clarification and commitment. So there's a fear of failure or fear of exposure during this time. And we see conflicts, but they may not come to the surface as group issues. So conflicts almost always, shortly in the developing of a team, we start to see, there are conflicts, but we don't always see them. They're below the surface. And it can occur through leadership, structure, power, and authority. While some remain silent, others attempt to dominate. All of that is a normal part of the group process. This first part, to get together, everything's safe. The second part, we start to realize that there's conflict. We may not expose it, we may not talk about it, but there is conflict around leadership, structure, power, and authority. And some stay silent, some dominate, but we tend to see the subgrouping occur at this point. And then we move to norming. Now, some groups, by the way, end here. And that's unfortunate. This is a normal part of the process, which is why we spend time talking about this. If people recognize this is a normal part of the process, they then can move on and into the more norming part of it, which is when we build cohesion based on trust. We get past the initial storming, we have our conflicts, now we develop a sense of trust. And that's when we get the sense of group belonging and personal relief. So that's when people can talk about things freely, ideas, ask questions, give feedback. People will listen and change their preconceived ideas. So people will be willing to listen within a team and be persuaded. And leadership is shared and cliques dissolve. Once we move from that storming, when cliques are created, if we actually get the norming and there's trust, then there's a sense of relief and becomes a group that some of those individual smaller groups can go away. They don't need to exist anymore. And it's a much more enjoyable environment. We can talk about ideas, people are open-minded, we share ideas, They aren't judged. They might be critically evaluated, but not judged. And people will, as a group, come up with a shared thinking on which everyone can agree. And then lastly, in performing, this is actually reached by very few groups. So once we go through forming, storming, norming, we get to performing, that's rarely, I would argue, reached. Here's where the depth of personal relations expands to true interdependence. So here in performing, every individual in the group is necessary for the success of the group, and they're interdependent on each other. They depend on each other as well. Individual members are self-assured without need for group approval. So I can do something, and if it's not accepted by the group, I'm okay with that. Group identity is complete, group morale is high, and group loyalty is intense. That's such a fun experience when you get to that point, when you're a sense of team and of belonging. And problem solving with support or experimentation with an emphasis on achievement. So at this point, it's all about getting stuff done. The personal agendas are put aside. We all work together well, and we can get to genuine problem solving with experimentation. Now, that doesn't mean that there still aren't people within the group who personally don't get along. That happens. There are people, let me rephrase that. There are people, members of the team, who aren't personal friends. That's okay. They can work together well. That's really what we're talking about. And then lastly, once the task is done, it comes to adjourning. The planned termination of the task and behaviors and disengagement from relationships. We share our successes, we say goodbyes. There might continue to be personal relationships afterwards, but this working relationship is what comes to an end. And people have to mourn that. People have to mourn that. I think we sometimes forget that. And we see teams or groups of people that get really to work together quite closely, then all of a sudden that person is no longer there and you miss them. And that can be a real personal response. So we have to remember that and give a chance to recognize what we've accomplished, recognize our participation, our achievement, and say goodbye. Now, there's a great book called The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, and I kind of rephrase it to make it more positively stated, but this is a really great book. I encourage people to read The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. And I'm going to, again, phrase it more positively, which is attention to results is at the very top, this sort of hierarchy of needs: accountability, commitment, productive conflict, and trust. Without trust, you really can't have anything else. And that leads to productive conflict, which leads to commitment, accountability, and attention to results. This is sort of like the hierarchy of needs that, of course, we're also familiar with. And we have to go through these particular phases in order to have attention to results and have a good, positive outcome. So I'm next going to do is spend just a few minutes talking about these areas and how to best achieve them. And I'm going to present tasks that are specific that start with very low-level risk to high-level risk. Starting with trust. Again, without trust, nothing else matters. So one of the ways we can help build trust is by sharing personal histories. In my class, I have students remind us again where they're from, what city they grew up in. I ask them personal questions all the time, low-level stuff, things like that. Because trust, one of the first things we want to do is start sharing personal histories. And that goes all the way up to high-risk things like 360-degree feedback. 360-degree feedback is exactly that, where everyone you work with gives you feedback when it comes time for evaluations. And evaluations can be informal and brief, like evaluating everyone's participation in a particular task. But I would argue personal histories is a really great way to start building trust. If ever I see teams not getting along, and by that I don't mean people not being friends, I mean conflict interfering with the function of the team, one of the first things I do is we stop and share personal stories. And we set it up for it. So I might say, next time we meet, everyone brings something that has personal meaning to them. And they'll bring an object and they'll have to discuss what that object is, something that we're, of course, willing to share. Or I'll ask them what's their favorite thing what's the favorite trip they've ever taken, or things like that. Kind of low-level stuff, just again, talking about their personal histories. It's a great way to start to build trust if you see a team not experiencing trust. Productive conflict. So once there's trust, then if we see teams they're kind of avoiding conflict, well, then we're going to develop productive conflict. And I would argue for challenge activities. A challenge activity is when you create or let them happen challenges. So oftentimes some sort of challenge will come up, and a leader will say, we'll deal with that later, or we'll just say, look, I can fix that right now, or I'll go talk to my boss about it, or something like that. And I would argue, no, let the team address that. In fact, if I see a risk, productive conflict, team's afraid to sort of have conflict, I'll create conflict literally by those simulation things that we all can't stand. I'll take, there's all kinds of them, the challenge activities. I really don't have time to explain what each of them is or to give a good example. But one is I take a tarp and it has squares marked off on it. It's like a 5x5 kind of square, and I'll mark off a pattern. And you have to step on the square that I've identified as a pattern. They don't know it. If you don't, you fall through and have to go start all over again. And so the team has to get everyone across this tarp by only stepping where the pattern is, and they don't know the pattern. So you have to work together. I create challenge activities like that to help create productive conflict and to help teams be willing to have conflict. And then afterwards, of course, it's really important you talk about it. Afterwards, you talk about, okay, what was the conflict? How did we handle it? What did we learn? It's really important to do that. What was the hard part? What did you learn from it? And all the way down to mining. And mining is really, really, really seeking out conflict, looking for where conflict exists and discussing it. Again, productive, but high risk. Low risk, it's going to be fun. People learn from it. But high risk, there's a possibility it could go wrong, is much greater, but the benefit could be much greater. Commitment, what to do. Commitment can look like a couple different things. Messaging, cascading messaging means, so now we're trying to get people to commit to the tasks. We're going to talk about what our messages are, and we're going to talk about how to build our messages. So in other words, every time we meet, we will say, okay, what's the takeaway from this meeting? And we write it down and we agree on that's our message as we go out. The high risk commitment, which really in this case, I don't think it's really that high risk. You stop and think about what's the worst case scenario. If we make this decision, what's the worst case that'll happen? And be extreme about it. Go crazy, right? I mean, think about what the absolute worst case is. And in that conversation, you realize two things. Number one, that's not very likely. And number two, it's probably not that bad to begin with. So if we see teams unwilling to commit to whatever we're doing, just simply talk about what our messages is to go forward. And then up to the high risk, which is worst case scenario, really think about what would happen if we make this decision. But again, I don't think the worst case scenario conversation is really all that high risk. And then accountability. If the team is now, we're trust and we are not afraid of conflict and we commit to it, but we just don't want to have accountability. We do a couple things there. Low risk, publication of goals and standards. So we simply state, this is our goal. This is what we're trying to do. This is how we know if we're going to get there. And we make that available to anyone. We put it up all the time when we talk. We tell our whoever it is, that's our relevant stakeholder, what they are, what our goals and standards are. We build in rewards for the team, not the individual. And then progress review is a review based on your progress. So based on accountability. So we tie our review, our evaluation, our personnel evaluation into progress towards goals. So we build accountability into our evaluation. Higher risk. A low risk thing is simply make the goals known among all of yourselves, make them clear. Let's discuss how we'll know when to reach those goals, and let's publish that. Let's make that available to whoever our stakeholders are. And then lastly, attention to results. So once we're at that point, and if we're through the accountability phase, man, our attention to results oftentimes comes into play. But still, if we still see a difficulty where we're not really focusing enough on results, we have to create more operationally defined results. We declare them, and now it's no longer progress. Now it's results-based rewards. So the previous phase, it was about accountability. It was reward and standards of goals and progress towards them. Now it's all about did you reach your goal or not? So the rewards is results-based. We're going to really define what that means, what that goal is, how we know when we achieve that result, how do we know when we achieve that result, and we declare that we've achieved that result or not. And then our reward is based on achieving the result. So this time we talked about the forming of a team and what to do when you see teams that are struggling along the way. Dysfunctional teams, is it a trust issue, is it conflict, et cetera, and what are some really easy, low risk, high risk things you can do to address that. Next, we're going to talk about a model to implement change.